Okay, so we're going to finish up section 4 here with Africa and the Middle East in the Cold War. So Cold War conflict also erupted in the Middle East. Egypt was the site of the first crisis. In the early 1950s, a nationalist leader named Gamal Abdel Nasser gained power in Egypt. To balance Western influence, Nasser accepted aid from the Soviet Union. Then, in July of 1956, he seized the Suez Canal, a key waterway operated by France and Great Britain. In response, France, Britain, and Israel invaded Egypt and retook the canal. The U.S., fearing a Soviet intervention, persuaded the Allies to withdraw. It then increased its own presence in the Middle East to secure its oil supplies and continue its support of Israel. Iran was another hotspot. After World War II, Iranian nationalists rose up against the pro-Western policies of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. In 1951, Iran's parliament, led by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, seized a British oil company. The new government also accepted Soviet aid and forced the Shah to flee the country. Fearing that Iran might become a Soviet ally, the U.S. carried out a covert action, which is a secret operation by the CIA. The action resulted in Mossadegh's arrest and the Shah's return to power. Over the next 2 decades, the Shah continued his efforts to modernize Iran. However, he coupled his policies of westernization with oppressive authoritarian measures carried out against his people by secret police. In 1979, he was overthrown and replaced by a strict Islamic regime. We actually see the CIA step in multiple situations in other countries because the U.S. was so concerned about communism taking over, and the U.S. did not want that, so they used the CIA to fix elections and things like that. So the Cold War also made a deep impact on sub-Saharan Africa. In the more than 2 decades after World War II, nearly every African nation had gained independence from colonial rule. A number of these countries were caught up in the struggle between the 2 superpowers. Congo was the first flashpoint. After gaining independence from Belgium in 1960, Congo desperately needed foreign aid and assistance. Its new prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, was an ardent nationalist. When the UN rejected his plea for aid, he turned to the Soviet Union for help. Fearing increased Soviet influence in Africa, the CIA worked with local army officers to overthrow Lumumba and install a new pro-American regime. The superpowers also got involved in wars in various parts of Africa, including Angola and Ethiopia. In Angola, a civil war in the mid-1970s pitted 3 rebel armies against each other in a vicious struggle for power. The Soviet Union and Cuba supported one army, while the U.S. supported another. China also got involved. A ceasefire was only reached in 1989. In Ethiopia, the U.S. and Soviet Union backed opposing sides in a war with neighboring Somalia. Both countries are located in the Horn of Africa, a region of East Africa with close access to the Middle East. The superpowers' involvement in the war reflected their strategic interest in this region. During the time period from 1945 to 1990, wars around the world killed some 40 million people. Most of those conflicts were related directly or indirectly to the Cold War. Other factors, including the legacy of colonialism, also played a crucial role in promoting conflict. But the power struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union exacerbated those wars and made them even more deadly. Okay, so we know that Congo, Angola, and Ethiopia are 3 sub-Saharan nations that were caught up in the Cold War. And then we also know that Congo got caught up because the UN rejected their leader's plea for aid, so he turned to the Soviet Union for help. And the CIA, an American organization, was so freaked out about that because, again, they didn't want any communism to spread any more than it already had. So they worked with local officers to overthrow that leader and install a new government that was sympathetic to the U.S. So we're going to move into section 5 and finally talk about how this Cold War ended. So the Cold War also took a toll on the superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. The cost of their rivalry, both in financial and human terms, was enormous. At times, it seemed that the struggle would go on forever. Eventually, however, Soviet power declined and the Cold War came to an end. All right, so the Soviet Union dominated Eastern Europe for more than 40 years. Subjugation of these countries, known collectively as the Soviet bloc, was critical to Soviet power. At times, however, the people of Eastern Europe tried to escape Soviet domination. In October of 1956, Hungarians mounted a revolt against their government and its Soviet backers. At the time, the Soviet Union had a new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, who had replaced Stalin after his death in 1953. Khrushchev had publicly criticized Stalin's harsh rule and called for a more humane path to communism. If you guys think back, remember Stalin instituted plans that ended up killing many people, starving them to death, and also assassinated many of his political opponents. So Khrushchev felt that was too harsh and called for that more humane path to communism. But this new approach did not include letting Soviet satellites leave the Soviet sphere of influence. Khrushchev ordered an invasion of Hungary to crush the rebellion. Some 20,000 Hungarians died, and a new Soviet-controlled government was installed. 12 years later, in 1968, the Warsaw Pact nations invaded Czechoslovakia to crush another reform movement. Meanwhile, thousands of Eastern Europeans tried to flee to a better life in the West. This migration was most evident in East Germany. By 1961, 2.6 million East Germans had fled by crossing the border between East and West Berlin and then moving on to West Germany. To stop the flow, the Soviet Union built a wall separating the two halves of the city. The Berlin Wall was up to 15 feet high and 100 miles long. It also included guard towers and minefields. So you guys can see on the screen here, you have East Berlin on the right, West Berlin on the left. And in the Berlin Wall was not necessarily just a simple wall. This is pretty intense, but you can see there's a road down the middle here for the Soviet soldiers to use. And then here's the guard towers. And then within all of this are minefields. So if somebody jumped the fence and walked, they could potentially step on a mine buried in the ground and blow up. I mean, that's pretty brutal. The Berlin Wall was patrolled by soldiers who had orders to kill anyone who tried to cross. Khrushchev admitted that the wall was a hateful thing, but he believed it was necessary to preserve communism. President Kennedy called the wall a vivid demonstration of the failures of the communist system. By the 1970s, the Cold War tensions began to ease up. Leaders on both sides embraced the ideas of détente, a French word that means a relaxation of tensions. Behind this effort to reduce tensions, however, was the continued threat of nuclear war. Until the late 1960s, the U.S. had held the edge in the arms race. With its more advanced nuclear arsenal, the U.S. believed it could force the Soviet Union to back down in any serious dispute. It was even willing to go to the brink of war, a policy known as brinkmanship, to make its point. This policy was based on the notion of deterrence, the idea that a country will not risk war if it faces the prospect of certain destruction. So on your screen there you can see the number of nuclear warheads that each nation held over the course of the Cold War and even into 2010. Well, 2014 or 15 actually, but the U.S. held the edge, I guess, in the arms race until the late 1960s. By 1969, the Soviet Union had caught up in the arms race. Each side was now equally capable of destroying the other. They also realized that their huge military costs were harming their economies. As a result, both nations sought ways to curb the arms race and reduce the risk of nuclear conflict. Détente began under President Richard Nixon. With his Soviet counterpart Leonid Brezhnev, Nixon negotiated an important arms reduction agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT, in 1972. This treaty limited the number of nuclear weapons each side could possess. Nixon also reached out to China, making a historic visit to Beijing in 1972. By normalizing relations with China, Nixon hoped to reduce tensions in East Asia, but he also hoped to play China and the USSR off against each other. At the time, the two communist powers were locked in a bitter rivalry to lead the communist world. They were willing to improve relations with the U.S. to further their own strategic interests. Détente continued through the 1970s. The U.S. and the Soviet Union expanded trade links and increased cultural and scientific exchanges. However, continued frictions, including arms control disputes, eventually brought détente to an end. The final blow came with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Communists seized power in Afghanistan in 1978. Civil war broke out and Muslim rebels threatened to topple the government. The Soviet Union sent in troops to occupy the country and prop up the regime. In response, the U.S. imposed tough sanctions on the Soviet Union, including a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. It also began supplying arms and aid to the Afghan rebels. The Cold War was back in full force. We're going to revisit the Afghan War briefly in Unit 7 because this is where we see the Taliban develop, and they are gaining control back again in Afghanistan. Soviet leaders expected a quick victory in Afghanistan, but like the U.S. in Vietnam, the Soviet Union soon got bogged down. They poured more money and troops into a war they could not win. The Soviet economy suffered, and thousands of Soviet soldiers lost their lives. The Afghan War undermined the power and credibility of the Soviet state. The last Soviet forces left the country in 1989. Afghanistan was just one of many problems afflicting the USSR by the late 1980s. In fact, the Soviet system itself was in crisis. The main problem was economic. The state-run Soviet economy could not compete with the private enterprise system of the capitalist West. Soviet citizens had low living standards and basic goods were in short supply. Although the Soviet people received free public services such as healthcare and education, the quality of these services was often poor. Soviet citizens also had less personal freedom than their counterparts in the West. When they saw images of Western life, many Soviet people felt their own lives were lacking. As a result, dissatisfaction spread throughout Soviet society. In 1985, however, a new Soviet leader came to power. Mikhail Gorbachev was a dynamic reformer who was determined to change the Soviet system. Gorbachev believed that conflict between communism and capitalism was not inevitable. Like another Soviet reformer, Khrushchev, he argued that East and West could peacefully coexist rather than pursuing an endless struggle for power. He also wanted to promote communism with a human face by embracing universal values such as freedom of thought and expression. Gorbachev proposed two main avenues of reform to revive the Soviet Union. One was called perestroika, or restructuring. Perestroika was intended to make the Soviet economy more efficient and productive. Perestroika reduced central planning and adopted some limited free market policies in light industry and services. For the first time since the 1920s, people were allowed in the Soviet Union to open small private businesses like cafes and repair shops. Gorbachev's second main reform was glasnost, or openness. Glasnost encouraged Soviet citizens to voice new ideas and suggest ways to improve society. The free flow of ideas was seen as essential to economic reform. Gradually, glasnost introduced greater freedom of the press and of public speech to Soviet society. Gorbachev also sought improved relations with the West, including new arms control agreements. U.S. President Ronald Reagan was at first skeptical, but he eventually recognized Gorbachev as a genuine reformer. The two pursued a renewed effort at arms control. Relations between the U.S. and Soviet Union warmed to levels that had not been seen since World War II. Despite all reforms, however, the Soviet economy continued to decline, and Gorbachev's reputation at home suffered. His reforms, including the Soviet renunciation of interference in East European politics, unleashed a popular push for democratization across the Soviet bloc. In 1989, the countries of Eastern Europe threw off communist rule, one after the other. On November 9th, the Berlin Wall came down.